Station. We're very happy to welcome you into a one-person panel. Unfortunately, Danson submitted a title, isn't here, and we're not sure if the second person is around, and if they are, they will join us. So in the interest of time, we are going to begin your presentation. And Oriole's talking about the Foxy fight in an African city and reading ways in which they centralize women's narratives, women's localized narratives. So what I'm going to do is I'm trying to also kind of look at the door. I will give you 20 minutes because you have time. And then maybe we'll have a conversation, and if people wish to, then you can walk to the English department and join the other panel after. That's it. Good. Okay, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so this talk is based on a chapter from my thesis, which has changed quite a bit in the theoretical background. I was looking at it as a localized narrative, as opposed to universal narrative. And it's changed quite a bit, and I've started thinking about how these stories are stories of urbanized black women, which I have found out is quite a unique thing. So, during the colonial era in Africa, various countries enacted legislation to prevent single women from entering urban areas, black single women specifically. And I'm going to take you through some of this legislation. So Christine Alba notes that in 1950s Kampala, there were laws requiring the repatriation of all single women found loitering in town. All single women migrants who were branded as prostitutes or loose women who were intent on satisfying the sexual needs of the male migrants and consuming some of their money, but who were not destined for marriage. So if you were black and you were single and you entered the town, you were immediately branded a prostitute. Under the Southern Rhodesian Natives Registration Act of 1936, a pass system for women was instituted to, as the Conference of Native Commission stated, put a check on the influx to urban centres of young women who evade parental control and enter all too easily into an immoral life. You can see there's very strong moral overtones to all this talk that's going on. This was fascinating. I went through some old 1920s, 1930s editions of the Rand Daily Mail. And in 1927, the then Officer of Health of South Africa, Dr. A.J. Milne, was of the opinion that an important factor in the slum problem is a lack of control over native women of undesirable character, who take up residence in urban areas. It is suggested that control could be gained over these natives if power were given to the authorities to remove or repatriate unattached native women from the urban areas. For the Director of Native Affairs is of the opinion that there are sufficient married native women in Johannesburg for the domestic requirements of the white population. I just love how unequivocal he is about this. We only want black women in the urban areas in order to serve our domestic needs. There's just no question about it. And in 1930, Peter Grobler, who was then the Minister of Lands, said very primly that young native women streamed into towns for reasons unnecessary to state. I thought that was a very prim phrasing of that. So Florence Stratton, in her book An African Literature and the Politics of Gender, goes through some of this legislation and points out that these ordinances were made in the name of female morality and contributed to the process of women's economic marginalization by relegating them to the rural economy, which in practice often meant subsistence farming. She also points out that it was useful for both the colonial powers and for the African men to keep the women in the rural areas, because it meant that they kept the homestead going, and then they also lacked power. It was the only way of earning money. Subsistence farming, as she says. They had no way of actually earning any money besides that. So they relied on the men, and they were therefore dependent, and it was a lot of patriarchal control. So African women began to challenge this narrative in their fiction. Miriam Clally's Oriole at the Metropolitan, published in 1975, is a fictionalized autobiography based on her work experience as an office clerk. And she goes through a lot of her experiences of racism and sexism and just an experience of a young, unmarried black woman trying to make it in the city. The Bride Price, which Emma Chase's juxtaposes the central character Kuna and her sister Ligaga, and it throws into sharp relief the effects of an urban upbringing and formal education on Kuna's self-liberation, whereas her sister is very meek and mild and just obeys what she's told. Emma Chase's The Joys of Motherhood, not as obviously, but also shows the change of character in Nunu Ego, when she becomes less conventional as she adapts to city life. And Flora Nwapa's One Is Enough is a novel in which urban migration provides the protagonist with opportunity to define her own life. She starts her own business, earns her own money, and defines life on her own terms. So these were women taking back the narrative that single black women in urban environments were powerless or didn't belong there. So my two texts are An African City and The Foxy Five, and these are both web series, which is very interesting because I work in the English department and I'm looking at these web series as texts. An African City is a web series that premiered on YouTube in March 2014. It became very popular, quite fast, because its narrative, as you'll see, is quite unique. It's essentially a Ghanaian equivalent of Sex and the City. The creator, Nicole Amatafio, I'm never quite sure of that, was a big fan of Sex and the City, and she was watching it one day and just decided that she needed an African equivalent. She didn't want the portrayals of women to all be negative and sad, and she wanted this glamorous image of African women. She says that she wanted something for African women, something for us and by us. She was tired of the sole narrative of African women being about poverty and disease, and wanted to see another narrative, one of beauty, glamour, and intelligence. She wanted a TV show about modern, beautiful, educated African women, sometimes doing unintelligent things or going through absurd situations, but comedic purposes. When it comes to the African woman, there's room for many stories, stories that we as Africans can take control of and share with the world. So she was very much owning the narrative and taking it back. An African City is a story about 5 women who've been either raised or educated in the West and sort of come back to Africa and how they adapt to being back in Africa with its specific ways of the city. It's set in Accra. Accra. Is it Accra? Sorry. And they all battle the traditional expectations that their families have of them in terms of getting married and having children, and they're all quite modernized and westernized in some aspects. This series became quite popular, especially with African women living overseas, because they said it was the first time that they saw a narrative that pictured their lives the way that they saw them. The New York Times did an article on it and said that it presented an unseen side of culture on a continent that is usually depicted with footage of war, famine, and poverty. So you can see how, again, she's just taking this narrative and wanting to portray African women as glamorous and beautiful and educated, and they eat in beautiful restaurants and they wear the most fabulous clothing, all by Ghanaian fashion designers who were very eager to showcase their work in the series that was being seen overseas. And the show's appeal comes from the ability to turn the same discussions that women around the world are having over cocktails and in group texts into salient critique of Western and African culture. And there is a lot of critique. There's a critique of attitudes towards gender and traditions and food and domestic workers, and they go over all this stuff, and it's amazing. the show is very glamorous. These women are wealthy and they live glamorous lives and they can afford to buy their own houses. And it's probably a little bit elitist. They have a lot of waiters that come and bring them drinks, and they have these long conversations by the side of pools, and they don't seem to do a lot of work. It's very Sex and the City. But I think you can see what Amatefio is doing. She's presenting a narrative that's not boring and dreary and people starving and war and famine. Unfortunately, the second season wasn't available on YouTube like the first season.
You have to pay for it.
You do, which I think is sad, because what I really love about web series available on YouTube is that they're available to anybody who has internet access, which of course again is not everybody, but there are people who can access YouTube as long as you have a smartphone or access to a computer lab. And the second one you have to pay for, and you have to have a credit card, so it immediately limits your audience. But the second season, they made more in a 24-hour period on VHX, this platform that they have the videos of the second season on, than they did in 2 million views in 2 years on YouTube. So they were obviously now doing it for the money, but it means that their audience is much smaller, and it's now people who have money who can watch it. I found it very interesting that in this article, the author said that until the arrival of an African city, the urban African woman lacked a pop cultural touchstone that could similarly create a new language to discuss the experience from career to friendship to romance. Because of its web series format, an African city succeeds where Sex and the City fell short, combining unabashed conversations about womanhood with global representation. So there is a far greater representation and diversity than Sex and the City, but it talks about the same things. It's about relationships, it's about fashion. And the protagonist is a very Carrie-like figure, Nanaya. She's a reporter, and she does these overtones which are very Carrie, these voiceovers, and she muses about things. But she's educated and she's smart and she's sassy, and I really, really enjoyed it. I would recommend you watch it. The Foxy 5 is a South African web series created by Jagu Nadia Newman. It's also been very popular. It was shown at the National Arts Fest here. It's been overseas. It's been to Paris, London, and New York. And strangely, because it's not the most expertly crafted web series, the shots are amateurish. The acting is sometimes quite amateurish. These are not professionals. These are amateurs doing something that they love. And it's just sparked people's imagination, and it's been all over the world. So Newman was inspired by the student protests. She said that she saw so many women leaders in these protests that she just wanted to create a narrative in which women were doing these powerful things that she'd seen them during the protests. She said she was so inspired by the women's student-led movement that she started writing a script about the experiences of black women and what are important to them. The series YouTube channel describes it thus. This web series follows the adventures of white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchy-smashing group of 5 young women from Cape Town, the Foxy 5. Each woman represents a different struggle and set of ideals within feminism. Despite their ideological differences and the clashes they often cause, the women are a tight-knit sisterhood that always manage to band together in overcoming the man. Very unapologetic in what they are. They're heavily influenced by the blaxploitation film Foxy Brown and the web series The Misadventures of an Awkward Black Girl. And I think that they point to the possibility of what television in South Africa could be if it's taken over by people who specifically want to create a certain narrative and create a narrative that's understood by a certain group of people. Newman says that it's very important for black women to be telling black narratives, because when we're talking about decolonization, we're talking about the media, film, and the narrative form. Because a lot of things that are in the series have actually happened to us. They've come to me with these stories. We've all spoken about these experiences. So everything we've put in the series is something that at least one of us have experienced. I want to reflect what black women are talking about right now, what we're feeling, what we're dealing with, and what we're doing unapologetically. And this is a shot from the first episode, which is about catcalling. They go out to a nightclub and get groped by some men, and they're so angry that the next morning they make these signs and go out into the street and march around very militantly about talking about catcalling. And funny enough, while they were filming this, the crew actually got catcalled by some bystanders on the street, and Human says the irony was just outstanding. You know, you're trying to make a film about how bad this thing is, and people are doing it to you right then and there. The series is very ambitious. They only have 6 episodes, 7, 6 episodes, and they cover sexual harassment, racism in primarily white schools, mental health, blesses, self-care during protests, trans misogyny, and colorism. They really try and cover a lot, and these episodes are not long. They're about 10 minutes. And I think because they try and cover so much, it's not very nuanced. I was thinking about the episode about blesses, and it was very shallow, and it didn't go into why these women would resort to this sort of thing, and what are the pros and the cons, and it's a very brief and shallow overview of what a woman who has a blesser would experience. And it's again, as I was saying, a little bit amateurish. The episode 4 begins with a warning that the episode addresses trans misogyny, and they say viewer discretion advised, and they misspell discretion. But this little things like this that show that these people, you know, they haven't edited as much as they could have. But I think that gives it a really raw and immediate feel, which I really love. I think that while recognizing that the series is flawed, it's important to realize that it addresses topics that are important to a certain demographic in South Africa that isn't often represented on film or in media. So, these are my series, and I wanted to talk about digitization, because both of these are web series, and the first season of African City and the Foxy 5 are available on YouTube for anyone who has access to internet. And I think that the nature of social media platforms, including YouTube, means that otherwise disenfranchised practitioners have the capacity to insert counter-hegemonic narratives into the conversation. Into this conversation about feminism, into this conversation about colorism, racism. People who don't often get a voice because social media is something immediate, and it doesn't have these gatekeepers that prevent them from talking about what they think is important. I was just thinking about that conversation yesterday with the curators, and they were saying that what they really love about curation is the voice it allows them to give to people who don't otherwise have a voice. And I think that social media does that. It allows people who don't often have a voice to say something that they think is important. And what, according to the reception of these web series, other people think is important too. I was just thinking about the Kenyan 2013 election. You know, social media empowered Africans to own the narrative and protest against what they saw as stereotypical coverage of their stories by the Western media. It was powerful. I mean, the hashtag Kenyans on Twitter, they're known because they're so powerful online. Yeah. There's a lot I wanted to say, but I think that the Foxy 5 gives a really real portrayal of what city life is like for young South African women. And an African city gives a realistic portrayal of a certain segment, obviously, wealthy women who had a Western education coming back to Ghana, but their life, and it's a life that isn't often portrayed on media. And I think that they've both taken back the narrative of black single women not belonging in urban spaces, and also digital media has allowed them to do this. Yeah. Oh.
Okay, because it seems we only have one presenter today, I'm going to invite us to have a conversation, and hopefully the people in the room who watched either one of the texts in question I've watched an African city. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So we can have some kind of similar. Okay. So I'm going to invite you to be in conversation with Oriole.
I'd love to know what you think
Yeah.
about the series.
And yeah. Okay. One hand. All right. Go ahead.
Okay, should I stand up?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Thank you for that presentation. As you were speaking, I kept thinking about the question of like, which black woman? I think with both series, they both groups of women are, well, I'll start with an African city. I think with an African city, I think they're classed in certain ways that configure their relationship to the urban space in different ways. Like I'm just thinking back to the episode where they talk about rent and paying rent for the year in that building, even though the power goes out frequently and there are all these struggles, but coming from very wealthy backgrounds, having parents who are government officials, gives them a mobility in the city that a lot of women in that space won't have. I even thought about how in The Joys of Motherhood, Nuego's experience of moving to the city is very different from their experience of moving or being situated within an urban space, and even being situated beyond an African city, from coming back from the West to Accra. And I even thought about with the Foxy 5 as well, their relationship to the city is also very different. I don't know, because they don't give very many details about each of the characters' relationship, but I think about how the cast members and even the creators, just as characters on the show and in their real lives, are very much linked to UCT as an institution. And they critique it. Like in the first episode, they have those AK-47s that they're toting on the Danny steps. But I think them being classed, or not necessarily classed, but being situated to an elite institution in that way changes how they situate themselves within the city that isn't typical for all African women. I think there are these very complex relationships about how black women relate themselves to the city that I think would be interesting to consider.
Absolutely. I think that an African city is, as I said, quite elitist. And they've received a lot of criticism for that. These are very wealthy women, and obviously the way that they orientate themselves is affected by that. I was just thinking in Foxy 5, there's an episode where Polly and I can't remember who the other one was, they're trying to move into a flat. And because Polly is light-skinned enough that she can often pass as white, she finds it easier to get a flat than her friend does. And there's that again, just the fact of her being black, perhaps not, she isn't poor, but the fact of her being black impacts the way that she can get a flat to live in. But definitely they are women with privilege, and I think that you're right, it definitely affects the way that they interact in the open spaces.
Can I just add to what you're just saying here? I think just in addition to the difference that kind of maps the range of women, kind of very limited range of women in this shows, I'm also thinking about the fact that you're using literature that's very colonial in its making, and that the definition of the single woman then as moving into the city as a threat, as a social, there's some bridging that needs to be done that works its way into what the contemporary scene looks like in Africa. And I was also thinking about Midele Josekun's work on the transnational post-feminist and what that looks like today. So that easy comparison to Sex and the City often comes quite easy. You know, it's not as seamless as it seems, and that often what these shows are doing in terms of reflecting a very particular kind of woman, young single woman in the city today. That there's some work that's happening there, yes, fine, classed, and as you say, race, actually, and all the various differences. There's something that's happening there that goes beyond that makes it much more complicated to do that kind of easy comparison in terms of the genre in which they work. And maybe that's also something that you can just throw into your main consideration.
Okay.
All right. It's an opportunity to think about the young single woman in the city. Yeah.
I think from what you're saying, in terms of where you started from, I'm still confused in terms of that history, because that is the reality of those women, and there was no choice. And this almost like fiction, because we know the character of the person and where they come from. And this is, like you said, they're acting and it's immature in a way. Then I think also in the choices that you make in your literature, you take from newspapers and things like that. Whereas there are these books that speak from, I think they speak from experience, you said? They're autobiographies, some of them.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Whereas I kind of feel like you could have used those as well in your introduction. But mainly I don't understand the literature with the digital, like the Foxy part.
Okay, so what you're saying is that the stories of the legislation is true and these are fictional and therefore they don't quite
Yeah.
Okay, I see that. I do think that the makers of these series did take quite a lot from their personal experience, and they received a wide reception in which people have said, yes, I identify with this. You're showing what I consider to be something quite close to my life. So I think that for a lot of people it's a true portrayal of a young single black woman in the city. Perhaps abbreviated and a little stereotypical, but it's there where it wasn't before.
Thank you. I'm at UCT, so I'll use a similar. But so I'm interested in the point you made right at the end about the democratization of access with the internet. And when I look at some of this, it's commodity capitalism and the use of commodity capitalism tied to particular kinds of femininities, which not everybody has access to. Not everybody has access to being able to perform and play with fashion in quite the way in which we see, fashion.
Absolutely.
So how are you thinking about the democratization of access through the internet and digital mediums, which, of course, we fantasize about being accessible to everybody, and it really isn't.
Absolutely.
So it is a much more constrained demographic than we like to be. So how are you thinking about?
It is something that I'm looking at. Obviously, there are areas in Africa that have far more internet access than others, and they usually are the metropolitan centres. I think South Africa is quite privileged in that. Many of our population, even if they don't have immediate internet access, will have a smartphone. But then, of course, they have to have data. So it's a commercial process, and it's interesting when you think about pop culture and intersections of pop culture and commercialization and capitalism, because I think they do get very messy and murky, because pop culture is supposed to be a representation of the everyman, or at least the aspirations of the everyman, and yet not every man can access them. So it's still something that I'm trying to, every woman, absolutely. it's very brilliant points.
Okay.
I mean, this is rather niche, but I think also just maybe a disclaimer about how YouTube as a platform is becoming less democratic.
Yeah.
In terms of what gets suggested, just the way the machine learning algorithm learns to flag things that are advertiser friendly versus not, and it's still very much influenced by large corporations.
Absolutely.
In that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, obviously it's more democratic than commercial TV networks, but maybe not as democratic as it was in the past, or as we'd like to think.
I think I've just been comparing it a lot to someone trying to publish something. Perhaps, if you were trying to publish a book the process you've got to go through, or get a TV series made. You've got to go through a bigger conglomeration, whereas something like YouTube does allow you to self-publish. And as Sarah's saying, there are barriers, and it means you've got to have data, and you've got to have some, a device that will be able to access the internet. There are certain barriers that are still there, but I think that the gatekeepers of publishing are diminished by being able to publish on the internet.
Okay, Floyd?
For me, so I haven't watched the Foxy 5 yet, but An African City is for me, so I think there are so many layers, and that's what makes it interesting, because it somehow tells so many other stories as well. So for me, coming from a Palestinian background, from my father, and all these expat people who, for instance, part of my family had to leave Lebanon during the Civil War, and then they came back. And so these stories are so familiar. So I think it's another form also of a globalized stories, also of women who hold down spaces, right? And it's interesting, it's always women. So when I go to my family, and it's the women who hold down, the household, the space. And but at the same time, then they're hold down, they talk like that. And I somehow, like people like Ngozi are so familiar, like how they have this kind of attitudes. I find that really interesting how it is intersects with other stories of migration, of like moving to some Western countries, but also of that narrative moving back, and then how do you fit in? So then there's also the families going back, and also in An African City, how then they discuss, are better than New York or Los Angeles, with all the power cuts. So I know also people going back to Lebanon complaining constantly. And no doubt it's very, very capitalist, stereotypical, actually horrible. But then it's actually also this, it's actually unashamedly so. It's just like that kind of claiming that space, the wife. I want to have the good stuff. I drive in the car to the shopping mall, and so I think it's really interesting. For me, it opens up what Chimamanda also calls, the other stories.
Yes.
So when I watch Sex in the City, it's like, it's not there. It's not that story of in between, of going there, coming back, of that kind of more complex stuff. So I think these things open up all these spaces in a very powerful way. So that's like, and then I don't think it's that problematic in many different ways, but at the same time, it's just like that power of storytelling, where I guess everyone knows these kind of families, right? Or these kind of groups of people, yeah.
I really appreciate the Foxy 5. I've watched a few episodes myself, and I knew a few of the women. I went to high school with them.
Oh wow.
And when I first watched it, what came to mind was it was a perspective of Cape Town that you don't generally see, or that isn't portrayed, right? So I know this experience of Cape Town because I know these women and I interact with these women. But things that come out of, I can think of like Koleka Putuma recently, and that sort of perspective that's coming out of Cape Town, but the very definite perception of these black women and these young black women is something that wasn't spoken about until recently. So that's an experience that I really, really appreciate. I mean, coming from Johannesburg, you think that these sorts of you think that these sorts of opinions or cultural sort of spaces only exist in Joburg, but seeing that from a media perspective as a representation of Cape Town, I really appreciate. So I think that's something that maybe could be.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's really wonderful that they're representing a demographic that often, I just think, hasn't been represented before. There's perspectives of these young women who are in university and they're politically aware, and it's just that narrative hasn't been around.
Okay. All right. I'll come to you later. I think the difficulty I'm having is to I think there are a few generalizations though, because to say that the narratives haven't been represented before, I would be careful, a little bit careful with that. I do admit that an African city was something, and he kind of, but the story that's there is a story that has been carried, whether it's in the soap opera. So if you go back to other popular, television forms, for instance, that you could catch a strand of this and that somewhere. But then an African city does do something quite interesting and unique. And having watched the Foxy vibe, so I can't completely speak to that. But I also do appreciate the work that you're doing with what Christine Obo, that you cite there, talks about when she says, it's almost like the middle class woman doesn't exist, leave alone the single woman, the middle class woman. Like, in the space of Africa, it's almost, this is also the same conversation that I've had to grapple with working with digital media. The very first time I presented a paper on it, somebody said, this is Africa. What are you going to say is happening on the digital space? People are poor, the gap, what is it called? The digital divide, yes. And I was like, yeah, is that part of the world conversation where the bulk of literature that's been done on the digital in Africa is, ICTs and, bless them, but developmental farmers in the Limpopo, which is also a very useful conversation. But then what do you do with the absolutely amazing production that's happening now? What do you do with that information? So I think you're adding your voice to that, and I think that's commendable. And also you're bringing in this category of women who often kind of remain silenced because, the really poor woman who is stereotyped as incapable of doing much for themselves and or whichever exists. But the work that we do as feminists is to surface the complete opposite, which is what this whole conference is about, to surface a completely different narrative. And so to bring these women, and young women for that matter, into focus is already work that you're doing to help break this public stereotype of this kind of woman. So I think, yeah, okay, I heard it. There are topics. Thank you.
I found it really interesting that Zoe brought up Koleka Putuma, because I was thinking of her as well, and about this lineage of feminist work that inspires the Foxy Five to come out of the space that it does, and in critiquing UCT. And I was thinking about how because it's been argued that Koleka's work comes from a lineage of South African women's poetry. So it's inspired by by Habiba Badaroon's own work. I wonder how that might help you in thinking also about situating the Foxy Five within the feminist lineage within and around UCT, with the feminist work down there.
Okay, actually bringing them from the lineage that's been around in that specific area.
Yeah, because they're in conversation with them at all times, and they're coming out of a conversation that has been going on for many years.
Yes.
I wonder how much Habiba's work would help you, how much Pumla Twala's work would also help you in situating that lineage.
I think that would actually be
because it bridges that gap between the literature you brought up,
yes,
and bringing it back into this context as well, because there's been a conversation that's been happening for many years.
There's also theatre work.
Who?
Theatre work. Theatre.
Oh, in theatre?
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know their names specifically. I don't know, but just check it out because I think the student was also from UCT, and then the play was at Baxter, and then it came to in Pretoria State Theatre.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Are we happy? Burning question, last chance. Okay, I'd like to thank you and thank everybody and thank the speaker who's been under fire because she's the only speaker. But thank you for the conversation, and you're quite welcome to join the other panel and or take a break as we wait for the next event. But thank you so much.